Okay, so with the moderator, I've seen Ambassador Herbst has made it. Dr. Åslund's here. Dr. Shatz is here. Dr. Cohen, our senior fellow, Margarita. Yes, she is. Okay. And our special commentator, as I told you at the beginning, has passed away. And but we will have Robert McConnell, another one of the founders of, in fact, this set of series, our roundtables and our annual report cards for the last 25 years. He's going to speak to Morgan's contribution to this very topic, which is market economics in the last 30, 40 years. Anyway, I'm simply, if everybody sits down at this point, Taras, I promise you'll get the muffins there. Dr. Cujo? Yes. The bottom line is that the one thing I do always enjoy on doing is introducing the moderators. As I told you, America has produced some of the best diplomats in world history. And in fact, in the last 20, 30 years, I think it's been especially important to have these individuals play the role that they do. And amongst them, the top of the top, we just saw Bill Taylor, and I'm about to introduce John Herbst. With folks like Herbst, Taylor, Courtney, Duke, and so on and so forth, America will never be remiss in terms of very solid diplomatic corps. So with that, Ambassador Herbst, it's all yours.
Walter, thank you very much. It's great to be here as always. Let me just say off the top, we all suffered a great loss last Saturday when Morgan Williams passed away. I met with Morgan, I think, around the time I arrived in Kiev as ambassador in 2003. And of course, he was a long veteran on the scene in Ukraine at that time. Essentially, an American presence encouraging the development of a modern economy, providing a vehicle for Americans who are coming to Ukraine, a vehicle for Ukrainians interacting with Americans to develop their economy. Indefatigable, and very, very smart. I don't know about you, but I imagine I know I'll miss Morgan a lot. I can't say more than a week or two would go by without my hearing from him. And again, I'm sure for you, some of that was more. Now, Robert, if you want to say anything about Morgan, why don't you do it right now off the top as a tribute to what he always does. But if you'd rather speak later, I'll accommodate you.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, that's fine. I know you're surprised by my leading with this. Okay. All right. I'm going to do something else which a moderator should not do, but say something on substance to start out. I'm really glad that I happened to be on this panel for this event, because the big news today, another serious blow at Vladimir Vladimirovich, came out of the G7 meeting, or rather the prep for the G7 meeting in Italy. I imagine some of you have seen this, but if you have not, the American position that the Russian asset, the interest from the Russian assets, which the EU already agreed should go to Ukraine, could be used to form a payment in this calendar year of $50 billion to Ukraine as a loan, low interest loan, collateralized by those Russian assets. This is a big step for Ukraine's financial security and overall security, because there's a connection between financial and overall security in Putin's war of aggression. I am confident that the Russians will huff and puff and not be able to do anything of significance. Maybe they'll send 2 more missiles tonight in Ukraine's direction, but that's about it. And of course, we all know that the vaunted Russian fleet is seeking refuge in the Caribbean. Something that our media have not really focused on. They have not been marching to the sounds of the guns. They've been running from the sounds of the Ukrainian sea drones. Okay, with that, let's get into our panel. You've got the extraordinary economic and geopolitical talent to my left. And again, the big news today is the $50 billion, which will be going to Ukraine. This is the single issue since Moscow's large invasion where the United States has led from the front. And I congratulate the Biden administration for doing this. That's Dalip Singh, who's the guy who really ran this, came up with this idea and pushed it very hard. That's Janet Yellen, who was a late convert, but used her heavy cannons to bring along the G7. And of course, the buck always stops in the Oval Office. So that's Joe Biden as well. So congratulations to all of them. Now I just hope they move on to the full Monty and take up the Zaryckyj and Larry Summer proposal for simply transferring the whole 300 billion. But the international community is not ready for that yet. So that's tomorrow's agenda. And with that, Howard, your thoughts on the move with the frozen assets?
Want me to limit to the frozen assets?
No. You have 7 minutes to speak whatever you.
So
We'll come back to you for more. But let's start with that.
So I usually look at what's happening outside Ukraine related to Ukraine's economy. This has been very good because I've looked at inside Ukraine, but I want to start with outside Ukraine because the two are intimately linked. And the 50 billion, I agree, right? It's been remarkable to watch the progress.
I've been corrected by the people who really run things. You have 10 minutes.
All right, I will use those 3 minutes wisely. The 50 billion being freed for Ukraine is actually a remarkable capstone to what has been growing momentum of international support for Ukraine. So since December, bit by bit, Ukraine economically, not necessarily militarily, but Ukraine economically has been put in the strongest position that it's been for more than a year. So what's happened in that time? Well, December, the European Council said they would open negotiations for EU accession. Now, it was contingent, and the contingency was quite quiet in the announcement, but they still decided to open negotiations. Same month, President Biden introduced an executive order on secondary sanctions. That's been consequential for Russia. That's degraded Russian external finance of trade. February, the EU approved its $54 billion Ukraine assistance package. What's interesting about that is 10 billion is in an investment framework designed to free up an extra 43 billion. So we're looking at about $100 billion over 4 years if everything works well. Then we have the US security supplemental, which at the same time included the US Repo Act to use Russian to allow the president to take US held Russian reserves. Quietly, right? Again, less public, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, thanks to an Albanian legislator, Albanian parliamentarian, Lulzim Basha, voted unanimously to say that it was the sense of all of Europe's parliamentarians, that the reserves should be repurposed to help Ukraine. And finally, we have the G7 decision to repackage the future stream of profits and taxes from those reserves into 50 billion for Ukraine by the end of the year. There have been other things, but it's actually been a remarkable 6 or 7 months in terms of assistance to Ukraine. So I had said before, and now I'm going to bring it down into what's happening in Ukraine itself. I had said before that the EU decision to open negotiations, it was much heralded in December. It was contingent. And what was it contingent on? Ukraine had to fulfill 7 criteria for EU accession. In November of last year, the European Commission gave a report card, and they said that 4 of the 7 steps had been fulfilled, 3 had not been fulfilled. Okay. More recently, the European Commission has recommended to all of its members that negotiations should now start. So presumably those 3 internal reform conditions have been fulfilled, at least to a certain acceptable degree. They relate largely to rule of law, corruption. There's one on minorities. And that's very important. So now that gets to the substance of the report card. And what I want to do, we had 4 subjects to look at. We had business reliability and transparency, fiscal and monetary policy, energy, and then plans for reconstruction. In terms of grading, and we'll get to grades, right? There is a very hard reality that Ukraine needs to face overall, which is that we can't grade it on a curve, because ultimately its success will depend on international investors and what the international business community thinks. So it's not enough to be able to say, yes, Ukraine is doing well enough under wartime conditions, because investors are going to look at Ukraine and say, well, that's all very good, but I'm not putting my money there when I can put it in 12 other much safer places. And so we do need to think about where the real gaps are. But I think the business gap right now is on business reliability and transparency. When you talk to investors and when you talk to policymakers looking at this, there have been gaps in the ability to manage projects, to prioritize projects. And in fact, we had a talk with a major investor who's involved in post-war reconstruction around the world. And, his view is, look, there's great opportunity there, but they need to establish a solid procurement process. They need to establish transparency. This was back in April, so it's very recent. And the good news about this, and so presumably we'll be looking at improvements over the next year. The good news about this is that the multi-donor coordination platform has just announced that they're developing a new project preparation framework for Ukraine, and that's coming out of Ukraine, the US, the UK, European Commission, and the MDCP in cooperation with World Bank, European Investment Bank, EBRD, to develop project preparation facilities. This is, if this works, this is one of What about sensible fiscal and monetary policy? Ukraine has actually done really well here. And this, it's not even putting Ukraine on a curve for the war. They have an extended fund facility with the IMF. The IMF has said they have fulfilled all performance criteria, all structural benchmarks. We've seen the fiscal deficit. The move in October 23 to a managed float. Till 2024, down from 26.6%. Amazing accomplishments, especially under wartime, but even outside of wartime, they're quite good. The two other areas I'll say only a few words about energy production, distribution. There, it's fair to grade on a curve because very few countries are facing constant attacks from the air, right? And energy infrastructure is a known target. This is an effort by Russia to make Ukraine essentially uninhabitable, to win by making it uninhabitable. And I would echo what everyone has been saying for the past year. Air defense is essential. So Ukraine doing the best it can. Finally, plans for post-war reconstruction. This is a harder one. Outside investors, again, are going to be very important. And there's been some turmoil in the top ranks of the Ukrainian government. So the dismissal of Alexander Kubarov and then the recent resignation of Mustafa Naim really need to be explained much more transparently to investors, potential investors, about what happened and how they'll be replaced and how reconstruction planning will go on. But here again, there have been positive developments too. And I would say the most positive development, pending further fleshing out, is the publication of a reform matrix that's prioritized in sequence. Because when you look from the outside and the inside at reconstruction, Ukraine is one country. It has 40 or more supporters, all of whom have their own priorities, all of whom have their own requirements. Keeping all of that straight is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And so formalizing all of the requirements that Ukraine has, all of its priorities, should better enable it not only to prioritize and sequence, but to deal with donors on Ukraine's own term. And our own work at RAND, our conclusion consistently has been that, yes, the US and Europe will lead reconstruction, but Ukraine sets the priorities. And this is the kind of thing that will help it set its priorities for reconstruction.
Thank you. That was quite a bit. I think it was excellent. Anders.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I should mention that I did a webinar with Morgan Williams Tuesday last week. And he seemed to be in perfect shape then. And then on Saturday, he passed away. I've known Morgan for 30 years. We met first in Kiev in 1994. And as John already mentioned, he was infatigable in struggling for Ukraine, for Ukrainian reforms, and for a good US and the Ukraine relations, in particular in the commercial area. So looking forward to hear Robert's more profound words about this great man. I will just come back from the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London. And in Berlin. It was in London last year. And this was a massive event with 3,000 people. And you wonder, why did it happen? And essentially this is networking, but it puts Ukraine on the agenda, and the big things are really happening elsewhere. Ursula von der Leyen was there and stated the European Commission's decisions to ask for EU accession negotiations with Ukraine to start now. And hopefully the decision will be taken later this month by the Council. A certain question mark about Hungary that they think that they can sort out. That's one big thing. As John mentioned here before, the $50 billion for Ukraine, a credit to be guaranteed by all the countries in proportion to their economies. And before the end of this year. That's a great achievement. And as John mentioned, it's Talib Singh who has come back as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, who has really carried this out. Without him, this would not have happened. And he wrote a paper about it earlier this year, before he had come back to the administration. And this is very much the US that has driven it, with strong support from Canada and the UK, while Germany was long against and eventually gave in, and France after that. But there are more things that should be done. As John already mentioned, they should take the whole $300 billion and seize the money. Here, the main opponent is Christine Lagarde for European Central Bank, who think that this would weaken the euro. Well, there are other things that weaken the euro, but not this. So she has got that wrong, for example, she. And then there's something that I think that we should press on all of us here. The US president has now the right to seize $5 billion of Russian sovereign assets in the US, and this money should be taken and passed on to a Ukraine fund. There's really no reason to wait doing this. And then something more, a third big issue that has happened now, that very substantial secondary sanctions that the US Treasury imposed yesterday, that happily started a currency crisis in Moscow again. Because it turns out that people are still interested in having dollars, and now they're not allowed to exchange as before. Howard already mentioned substantial Ukrainian economic achievements, and I would emphasize 4 points here. The first is the fiscal. The Minister of Finance, Sergei Marchenko, who's a very tacit and humble man, is the real hero in this situation, because he managed to keep Ukrainian budget in perfect order. Last year, Ukraine had a budget deficit of 40 billion and got 42.5 billion in international support. This year, when things looked worse, the Minister of Finance cut it to 37 billion, and it has got that money guaranteed already. Of course, we don't know about next year, and that's a question. But the reserves are now $39 billion, just about the highest they've ever been. So it's truly remarkable, as Howard said, how well Ukraine has done on macroeconomic. The second thing is the Black Sea Canal. Of course, that's mainly a military achievement with primarily support from the British government, also from the Norwegians and the French. But this means that Ukraine has now full shipping volume as before the war through the Black Sea, along the coast of NATO member states. And it seems as if the Russians have given up to threaten it, that they are too afraid of losing more of their expensive ships in the Black Sea, so they prefer not to act. The third thing that is often mentioned, but I think that it should be emphasized, it's agriculture. Ukraine last year had nearly a record harvest of 82 million tons of grain. It had more in 2021, but this is quite extraordinary. You often hear about the mining of the fields, which is a huge problem, but the agriculture is working with full speed forward regardless of that. And then we don't think of it as economics, but drones. I realized that the enterprises at this Ukraine Recovery Conference, they were mainly producing drones, and they were there in order to get international financing for the drones and to see all the very specifically. They had out of 41, they had now rebuilt 5. They will soon have 10 of them in action, and perhaps who is your owner? And then, oh, we don't like coal. How can you use coal in these green times? And then they to act for. Probably all aware of the mobilization law. And the problem only that men of 18 to 24 are no longer, are not mobilized, but nobody knows who will. It can't be done like this. This has to be changed, and it has to be changed soon. Then a third thing that the former head of the National Bank, Valeria Hontareva, has recently emphasized, that is that Ukraine has far too high interest rates. Actually, today, they cut the interest rate, the NBO cut the interest rate from 13.5% to 30%, but inflation is 3%. That means that if you are a commercial banker in Ukraine today, you do one thing. You put your money with a national bank and you get 10% real interest rate. So why would you risk your money giving it to Ukrainian enterprises that need the money, but not at that price? So this is intolerable. It was good to have the high interest rates early on, but now they have to come down. And another complaint that in particular the European Business Association has pushed recently that liberalize foreign exchange more. So the big private enterprises, there are about 5 of them that have Eurobonds, can now not service the Eurobonds and will do technical default if they don't get a special permission to pay. You can't do this. Ukraine has enough money. The total servicing of Eurobonds, I heard, would be €500 million. This is just ridiculous. This is bureaucracy at its worth. Then on the Western side, Ukraine Recovery Agency is needed, and I think that will be the result of this international funding now coming for Ukraine. It needs to be strong and not like this multi-donor coordination platform. If you can remember that, then you remember too much. And then finally, on governance, we have certain complaints about governance, but I think that this will be EU-driven now. If EU accession starts, then the EU becomes much more heavy-handed and hands-on than otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Margarita.
Thank you. Is it, do you need to,
Yeah,
I need to move
you
this?
need it.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this distinguished forum today, because this is an extremely important time. And I'm going to talk about the energy sector of Ukraine. And this is the crisis point right now in Ukraine, as it was mentioned earlier. We know that the energy sector of Ukraine has been targeted by Russian missiles and drones since the beginning of the war. There was a lot of damage, but the system managed to survive. The workers of the energy enterprises, state companies that connect the wires when they're destroyed and when they cut and restore facilities were doing heroic work for 2.5 years. But since March, Russia has increased the attacks on Ukraine and systematically started destroying facilities. The President Zelensky and his government have said that 50% of Ukrainian electricity generating capacity is destroyed. The peak consumption last year was 18 gigawatts. Russia's strikes has destroyed 9 gigawatts and probably 9.2. And according to Minister Shmyhal, who also confirmed this number, 40 more power capacity of the country is destroyed. 20 units of hydropower plants are damaged or destroyed with a total capacity of 1.3 gigawatts. So this is very problematic, not only because of the destruction, but because of the fact that they're very difficult to destroy, to restore, takes time, takes a lot of and a lot of money to build another dam and to build another thermal power plant. Ukraine is buying energy now from the European Union. Just remember at the beginning of the offensive, almost 1.5 years, Ukraine was continuing to export electricity to the European market. It was managing to do this for quite some time. Now Ukraine has to buy energy from the European Union, and kudos to Poland and Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary for stepping in and supplying electricity to their neighbor. But that's not going to be enough. Therefore, the government has instituted very severe restrictions of energy consumption. And the numbers are pretty staggering because last week, for example, there was no electricity for 78% of the time of the week. 70% of the hours of the week were without electricity. And this was throughout the country, including Kyiv, which was hit hard when the thermal power plant was destroyed a couple months ago by a Russian missile. Since then, it's been very difficult for Kyiv. Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These are the regions that they want to submit. They want to establish some kind of victory over these regions, expand the territory that's controlled by Russia. And then already we have talk by Russian officials around Putin that they want a peace talks with the respect, and Putin said that, preserving the status quo, meaning new realities on the ground. That's how he calls them. At the same time, the government is taking new measures to meet the energy crisis, because the expectation is that in the summer use is going to be more energy deficit, and in the winter, of course, because of the heating that will be needed, more energy deficit will arise as well. Minister Shmyhal emphasized the government meeting priorities. They have developed a program to strengthen the air defense system. This is what President Zelensky Western allies in Berlin this week. Repair the damaged equipment and further develop of drone defenses, decentralize the energy system, secure international support in cooperation, energy efficiency and responsible severe restrictions of energy consumption. One of them is going to be the enterprises will not be able to use air conditioning during the summer months. And some productions that require part of the production cycle, and this is going to affect the blackouts and the restriction of using of air conditioning. Going to affect the economy. If you don't have electricity, the consumption of energy is restricted also for the population, and this is particularly difficult for young families living on the 8th and 10th floor of apartment complexes without elevators and with much more high need energy when there is also a procedure that was approved to provide financial state support to individuals who install generating facilities from alternative energy sources, together with the storage in their households. Whether people are going to do that, we don't know. It's very risky to invest in your own household and develop renewable energy facilities when you don't know whether your house is going to survive the war. And that's actually the case not only in the East, but also in the West. There are several international agreements and also several initiatives internally. The Ukraine Energy Support Fund, for example, this is agreement with the European Commission and the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine. Also the Ukraine Facility, an initiative by the European Union, EU mechanism to help Ukraine in its recovery, reconstruction and modernization efforts. The Ukraine facility will allow European Union to provide Ukraine with up to 50 billion in stable and predictable financial support between now and 27. And at the Ukraine Recovery Conference this week, President Ursula von der Leyen announced the signature of 1.4 billion in new guarantee and grant agreements to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, which is part of the Ukraine Facility Investment Framework. This is private investments that are going to go into the Ukrainian energy sector. There is an agreement between Ukraine and France. They signed a grant agreement to help restore support and support critical information infrastructure and priority sectors of the economy. One of them is energy. A memorandum with EBRD was just signed for 300 million to go to the energy sector. And the government has approved a European 30 million euros from the German-based KfW for Ukrainian Ergo. So these are the main points about Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine and how the energy sector is facing unprecedented crisis. But I want to add for 1 minute only the effect of the Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy facilities, because this is also bringing consequences for the Russian energy sector that are unprecedented. According to statistics, almost 1 million barrels per day reduction of capacity of Ukrainian refinery facilities, of Russian refinery facilities has been recorded by energy companies. The capacity that is destroyed or under construction or repaired and hit again was estimated about 14%, but probably it's higher because the strikes are continuing, and this data is a little bit from at least a month ago. And Russian export of fuel, diesel and gasoline continues to shrink, and Russia resorted to importing fuel from Belarus and Kazakhstan. So this is having a very, very important impact on the Russian energy sector. And as the sanctions have not been able to produce the effect that we wanted and we expected, Ukrainians are supplementing this, achieving their own goals. Of course, this is leading to more strikes, probably more revenge by Russia on Ukrainian energy sector. So until we see a really significant impact,
'Energy colleagues covered a lot of that, but I would like to start with the Russian strategy. Russian strategy throughout 22-23 was to destroy distribution networks, transformers, and such, but they did not focus on generation capacity on power stations as much as they're now. Now the generation capacity +50% more, or 50+% less generation capacity. Hydro plant is severely damaged. The ponds, hydro, Dneprohes, Zmyevskaya, and lately Tripolskaya is severely destroyed, severely damaged. And they're justified by saying that they're denying electricity to the Ukrainian military production. That is not a justification from the humanitarian point of view. This is that doesn't make sense even from the Russian perspective. I believe that the main reason they're doing this is to break the Ukrainian spirit. That's number one. Number two, they're doing it to demonstrate to the Europeans what may happen to them if they continue to escalate and have a war with Russia. And this is an interesting and important point. The next point I'm going to make, I wanted to make it in conclusions, but I'm going to make it now. And that is that Russia needs to taste the medicine that they're dishing out, meaning sources. Main task of the next few months is to develop strikes. This is very dangerous. I don't need to explain to you how catastrophic this can be. And they say, oh, don't worry, it won't provoke a new Chernobyl. How do they know? What if that Kinzhal missile will veer off by 10 meters and hit a reactor as opposed to a transformer in a nuclear power station? Are capable to locate site fast. Of intermittency and the lack of storage are causing as a limit to our solar. The success of Russian attacks is caused by insufficient Ukrainian anti-air capacity. That anti-air capacity is caused in turn by the lack of our production capability of Patriots and other anti-air, and because of this horrendous 7 months pause caused by our Republican friends in Congress. Now, hopefully, this is changing, although in today's news, the Pentagon said they're not supplying additional Patriots yet to Ukraine. I hope that this is going to change soon. So clearly, the Patriot Hawk Stinger systems need to be supplied. By the way, for those of us military geeks, Patriot Hawk and Stinger are 20, 30, and 40-year-old systems. Looking at the geostrategic map in Europe, in the Straits, in Taiwan Strait, and in the Middle East, we need much more, not just anti-air, but also anti-drone capacity. The estimated cost of destruction in the energy sector in Ukraine is 56.2 billion. The cost of rebuilding is 50 billion. I think it's a nice round number that the current G7 measures can address. To wrap it up, the demoralization of Ukrainian population, destruction of industrial capacity, and freezing of Ukrainians in winter are the main goal of this campaign. The question arises why Europe still imports Russian LNG, liquefied natural gas. This is 20% of the total LNG consumption. The question arises, as Europe is in a critical energy deficit, why the Biden administration, and I agree with everything John Herbst just said about kudos to the G7 decision, why the Biden administration froze the future approvals for LNG infrastructure. Yes,
in Kansas. Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, he was his agricultural legislative assistant on the Senate Committee of Agriculture. I won't list all his connections, old and new, with Kansas, but he was a Kansan. And he went to Ukraine. Sometime in the mid to late 1990s, Morgan went to Ukraine and at first focused primarily on, surprise, agriculture. Indeed, for a short time, he worked as a consultant to our US-Ukraine Foundation in Kiev. But Morgan and the US-Ukraine Business Council became synonymous. It will always be hard to separate the two. The US-UBC was established in 1995, and I don't know if people here would remember or know. Originally, the US-UBC was headed by a former State Department official and a Russophile. It was looked at with concern and suspicion. But at the end of 2007, Morgan was elected to president and everything changed. We at the US-Ukraine Foundation became very close to Morgan as he worked to build that fledgling organization. He rented space from us to contain his expenses as he would build the US-UBC from just a few members and virtually no programs. And build it, he did. US-UBC now has at least 230 members, active members, and is a powerful voice for business in Ukraine, heard in Kiev as it should be, and certainly heard here in Washington. Program after program, meeting after meeting, Morgan's US-UBC has been tireless in support of business in Ukraine, educating, consoling, petitioning, demanding, with messages vital to business and vital to the growth and strengthening of Ukraine before and during Putin's barbaric invasion. Morgan's influence has been felt anytime business and economics are discussed about Ukraine, and he will continue to be felt. But interestingly enough, Morgan, the Kansan, fell in love with Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, and became even more than a force behind US-UBC. In Ukraine, Morgan learned about the Holodomor, and he became an advocate for pressing the world to know, understand, and appreciate the horrors of the Holodomor. Morgan started collecting paintings on the topic of the Holodomor. It turned out that there were not very many works of art about Stalin's forced famine. Ukrainian artists, even in the 1990s, were still afraid to address the issue. But Morgan began to encourage Ukrainian artists to do so. Painting after painting, a collection began to emerge, which Morgan Williams himself called, quote, canvas that never existed, end of quote. Now Morgan's collection includes about 2,000 items, paintings, engravings, posters, and stamps about the Holodomor. This collection has been repeatedly exhibited in Ukraine and across the world, telling the truth about the genocide of Ukrainians in the language of paintings. That is all on and because of Morgan. The head of an important and thriving business-related enterprise, Morgan's Heart, genuinely responded to Ukraine's history, pain, and he acted to help make that history known and understood. Over the years, Morgan has received many accolades in Kansas, in Ukraine, in Washington, and rewards he has, stacks of them. But I think his lasting memory and greatest reward as a champion of Ukraine is that His passing away, his legacy of caring and working for Ukraine for a strong and independent future is how his loss is felt by people who knew him and appreciated him. May he rest in peace.
Robert, thank you very much. That was in fact, why don't we have one moment of silence in Morgan's memory, and then we'll proceed to the Q&A. All right, thank you. So, audience questions, we have one over there.
I have another two-part question. So the first part of my question is, would you perceive that the world's kind of, I guess, apathy towards Russian energy and their persistence on still investing into Russian energy? Is it with Uzbekistan? And then the second question is, what is in the economic recovery of Ukraine, what place do the oligarchs have? I mean, they have a lot of power currently in the economic system of Ukraine. It would be impossible to just make them go away. What happens to them in this rebuilding?
I'll take the first part. You have to distinguish between the West and the West. The West is at least trying. We gave up Russian oil. Oil is a global commodity, it's shipped around the world. It's not that difficult. Thank God for fracking. We do have much more oil now than we had in 2005 here in these United States. If not, we would be going, begging to Venezuela, Iran, possibly to Putin, Saudi, etc. In terms of what we do still buy, LNG in Europe and uranium both in Europe and in the West, as I mentioned before, we need to build a new supply chain. This is not rocket science. Nuclear industry is 70 plus years old, civilian nuclear. So we had our own mining here in the United States, Canada, Mexico, you name it. We can also do it elsewhere in what is called friend-shoring countries. In terms of the rest of the world, notice that Comrade Xi Jinping is not rushing to buy more Russian gas. Part of it is squeezing Putin for, in the spirit of eternal unlimited friendship, squeezing him for domestic gas price. So that's, I understand that. But when it comes to energy, look, it's a very sort of interest-driven business, right? You cannot go to some village in Africa and say, well, because of great geopolitical considerations, we don't want you to have electricity. And people do that. People who are green absolutists do that all the time. They say, oh, don't build this gas-fired power station, or God forbid coal. I mean, I guess coal, but yeah. In terms of us, for example, in Africa, I just know it, firsthand. We would focus on environmental regulation, on other social issues. We will not help them to build power stations. We outsourced it to China and to Russia, and that's what we have. But we need to engage them. India, Southeast Asia, with every country, this is why we have the State Department. With every country, we need to try and minimize Russian procured purchases of energy. In terms of Western investment going to Russia, no, it's not going to Russia now, but it will in the future if and when the sanctions are lifted. And there's a lot of money outside of the West. The Middle East is a huge source of investment, so is China. So we need to think creatively. How can we prevent these characters from investing into Russian energy.
I absolutely agree. If I can add to that, we're talking a lot about Russia preserving its positions on the oil market and even to some extent the gas market, but we are actually mistaken. The volumes that they exported have not gone much lower than before the war, but they are not going to the most lucrative markets in Europe. They are going to China and they're going to India, and they have started reducing Russian oil as well because of problems with payment, because of problems with the cut price, because of problems of shipments and insurance and so on. So there is a development now that is worth watching. I'll give you one number about the Russian LNG to Europe. Because the European market is still the biggest market for Russian LNG. And how much is that? 17 billion cubic meters. 17 out of 450 BCM consumption of the European Union. So this is 298 BCM. Yes, I mean it's a fraction of the consumption of the European Union, and 17 BCM. This is the largest market of Russian LNG. What we're talking about, these are small quantities and they are not really that important, but European Union needs to make a decision about Russian gas imports for sure, because right now the biggest conduit of Russian imports of gas, exports of gas to Europe are through the Black Sea, to Turkey, and from there to the Balkans. From Bulgaria it goes to Serbia and Hungary without Bulgaria receiving any Russian gas, but nevertheless serving as a transport corridor. So this has to be regulated, it has to be replaced. And I don't see America reducing that much the exports to Europe. We're talking about licenses being stopped for new production, but the old licenses are working. And they saved Europe from the energy crisis in 22 and 23. So I think that we can still export as much as we do and even more based on the existing licenses. And I'm sure that after the election here in November, a lot of things are going to change, including that directive to stop temporarily the issuing of new licenses. I think it's a mostly election tactic that is aimed to please the green activists in this country.
On oligarchs.
Yeah, let me answer on the oligarchs. I could name the oligarchs, but I'm not going to do so, because whenever I do, I'm being sued for defamation in any country that you could not expect. Last time it was in a local court in Hamburg, so in Germany. So you are not allowed to name oligarchs. The oligarchs rule over the free world. There's no free word when it comes to oligarchs. Think of that, and you may notice that you don't see any relevant information in the media about them in the offer. So let me just discuss them in terms of categories. You have one category that are obvious traitors. Some of them are Russians, some just traitors, and they have had their companies confiscated, and they're out of the country, or in the odd case in prison. The second group are oligarchs who committed serious crimes before the war and had to flee the country before the war. They are out, and their enterprises are increasingly being confiscated. Then you have a third group who are the most ominous ones, who are serious criminals, but close to the rulers that are there. And it's quite uncertain about their status. That's one asks, are they arrested or not? And if they are arrested, is it in a luxury hotel or is it a real arrest? So this is the interesting category. And then you have quite a few big businessmen who have continued working as before. And if you look upon it more broadly, the oligarchs have suffered enormously from the war. If you think of it, the heavy industry is in the east, and Donbass, Kharkiv, Zaryckyj and Dnipro. And those are the factories that have been destroyed. So if you take in Mariupol, Akhmetov's two big, sorry, Ariel, I'm talking. But two big steelworks in Mariupol. Akhmetov is now suing the Russian Federation for $17 million in the European Court for Human Rights, attached to the Council of Europe, which is not a very strong court. So it's very unlikely that he can get much money out of it. But this is an interesting case to follow. But think of it, it's a big, heavy industry that was all owned by oligarchs that has been beaten up. So the overall effect of the war is undoubtedly that the oligarchs have lost enormously. And if you look upon these four categories, three of them have really lost big.
Okay, question over here, and please, one question. And not a two-part question, actually.
A very direct question for Anders concerning the $300 billion assets, which the question is, what's the rationale of Christine Lagarde for really going along with this? And is her rationale, does it have any validity? I think that's it.
Thank you, Jaroslav. A very easy question. No, there's no validity. There's no rationale behind it. This is simply ignorance. Her argument is that the euro might lose out as an international currency. As these various Western currencies. There are only two big currencies in the world that can be used as reserve currencies in a big way, and that's the dollar and the euro. Gold has increased from 9 to 11% of currency reserves. Gold can't be a competitor because it is too limited, but that is what people are rushing to. So this is nonsense, and it's also moral nonsense. Is the European Central Bank there to service kleptocrats in odious authoritarian countries? I thought that it was there to serve Europe and not odious kleptocrats.
Actually, I'm going to slip in a question related to this, but a quick answer, Anders, although Ariel may want to jump in. I don't need to exclude anybody else. Wasn't the decision taken by the G7 with the $50 billion actually also a blow against China, which was pushing very hard the French and the Germans not to move on this? Right?
Yeah, and also there are some other countries that you would not expect, like Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, that were pushing against it. So this was, so to say, Russia's global south that it's worth remembering that they took that position, but of course that's the countries that want to salvage their currency in the ECB, so that they are not being excluded, because then they have nowhere to go. There are only two decent reserve currencies in the world, and that Christine Lagarde should know.
Okay, James, last question.
My voice carries enough. I don't.
It does, and we don't understand.
Oh. Right. A short question, I hope simple. How do you assess the significance of uninsured vessels under various forms of Russian ownership, both in the context of energy supply, but also sanctions evasion, and what steps do you believe can and must be taken?
No. Yes.
It's a serious problem. There are reports in open sources that Russia is moving tens of thousands of tons of oil, millions of barrels of oil every year, gaining revenue. The only sort of saving grace here is that black market or gray market, black market oil is discounted 20–30%. And they are so desperate that they're moving it. The last time large-scale smuggling of oil took place was Saddam Hussein breaking UN sanctions and Iran breaking sanctions. Iran's still doing it. Just recently, I saw a report of a Russian tanker or Russian-controlled tanker reloading oil into another tanker, probably Chinese, somewhere offshore Singapore. The question is, an international maritime law question is, can you reclassify oil smuggling in a war situation as piracy and apply piracy laws to these tankers? And there, shades and grades if it's, Panama flagged or Liberian flagged tanker, but we know it's controlled by the Russians. What are the implications of that? Clearly, in the escalating global conflicts, which we see now in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Taiwan, and they are interconnected and intertwined. Russia is talking to Iran a lot. China is talking to Russia and Iran. Everybody talks to North Korea. Everybody from the axis of weasels talk to North Korea, and they talk to Venezuela and such. So the issue of illicit maritime activity, in my view, is a neglected issue, should be escalated, should be discussed. And for now, thank God, the US and the allies have a predominant naval power, and we need to use it.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to thank our panel for a terrific discussion. And
We have grades or?
Oh,
Grades. Yeah.
well, that's
You can
right.
ask grades.
My apologies.
It is a report.
Let me pull up. Okay. So the category is developed market economics, assessing Ukraine's progress, regress. All right, panelist number one, Howard.
Overall grade?
Overall grade.
And a little explanation, 1 sentence explanation.
All right. So I would give them, I haven't come up with an overall grade. I would give them a 5 for sound fiscal and management. So strong progress. But good. Business reliability and transparency, I would say no change for now. Energy, not their fault. There's been regress, something that really needs quite big attention from the international coalition. Plans for post-war reconstruction, I give progress. So that's probably about let's be generous and say 4. Let's call it progress.
Okay, well, that was very thorough analysis. Thank you. Thank you. Anders.
I would give an overall 4. The positive, what Howard emphasized, very good macroeconomic management, but then the National Bank has not performed sufficiently recently, and the mobilization law is a disaster that has to be changed. On energy, I think that they've been outstanding. On Black Sea shipping, outstanding. So that gives me 4 overall.
Margarita.
I would give for the energy sector certainly 5 for resilience and heroism. I would say 4 for dealing with transparency and corruption. There is still work to be done, but the work is well on the way. Most important factor here is going to be whether the oligarchs are going to determine the reconstruction of energy sector of Ukraine, whether they're going to be the only investors or whether there will be Western investors to offset their power in Ukrainian society and economy. And I would say 5 for the government's ability and policy and work done to reach out to donors to set up funds for reconstruction and to institute policies that are sometimes incredibly restrictive, but they're still saving the country from collapse.
Thank you. Ariel.
In the wartime, I cannot cast stones at you. Those of you remember my very tough rating before the reinvasion. Now it's 5 for energy. It's probably 3 because of transparency, and the rest of 4, and it washes out to 4 overall.
I hesitate to go against this very distinguished panel. I would also give a 4, and I would note that 4 is actually a pretty good grade given this massive invasion that they are seeking to manage. And that's something which we don't see enough of the context of this in the media discussion on Ukraine's economy and Ukraine reform efforts. With that, thank you, our panel. And I think lunch is going to be ready in many minutes. I must say, I appreciate your.
Folks, just as a reminder, we have about 15 minutes to 20 minutes for the lunch, and then we have to come back. Otherwise, we have a dead stop.